Well, hello, everybody. This is a very strange experience to do one of these webinars because unlike theatre, here I am talking at a screen. I can't see an audience. I get no sense of reaction. And one of the great buzzes of live theatre, that energy you get from an audience is completely lacking. When you tell a joke, nobody laughs. I mean, that may happen to me all the time anyway, but in this particular case, it's particularly upsetting. But I'm going to try and talk a little bit about my experience of working in the modern theatre. One of the great advantages of having been at Cambridge, where it's had such a long tradition of producing theatrical stars, and partly because of what I work on in Greek tragedy, I've had the good luck, the good fortune, really, to be involved in the theatre, particularly in the Almeida Theatre, but also at the Globe and the National, with various productions of Greek tragedy, as well as James mentioned, the Cambridge Greek play, which has become a fully professionalised production, although using student actors, in the last 15 or 20 years since I've been involved with it. And what I thought I would do today would be to talk about two particular themes that seem to me to be absolutely crucial for understanding something about Greek tragedy in the modern theatre. The first I'm going to call knowledge and knowingness, which is, a grand title. What I mean is fairly simple. If you think about Greek tragedy in any way at all, you'll recognize when you read it or study it, that it's deeply embedded inside a cultural context. I've spent a lot of time thinking about that cultural context, about the way in which the festival of the great Dionysia establishes a political framework for understanding the plays, with the rituals that come before the plays, with the generals on stage making a libation as if they were the cabinet on stage before a play, and with the parade of orphans and whatever, the war orphans whose fathers had died in war, the parade of the tribute of the empire. I mean, it's a real imperial political occasion, Greek tragedy. And that's one sort of embedding. And the other sort of embedding is that every script of tragedy that we have, or the scripts that were produced by Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, are full of cultural references, as we might call them. That's to say, they know perfectly well, they say the word Zeus, and you have a series of connotations in ancient Greek about Zeus. You say the word Aphrodite, and you get a bit of a shiver, because you know what we're talking about. And there's a whole series of potential references to Homer, to other Greek literature, and even one or two occasions in tragedy only to the contemporary political circumstances. So in that sense, tragedy is written from within a culture to a culture. And what I would always say about it is it takes the opportunity to represent the city to itself. That's what tragedy is about. It puts itself on stage and questions itself. It does so not by putting Athens on stage, that's extremely rare, but by putting on stage a version of the city that looks like it's going to be somewhere else, but turns out to be about you. You may think that Oedipus is about something altogether different, but when you come down to it, it's about what you know. So tragedy as a cultural event, when you transport it to London in the 21st century, has a series of problems for a director to face. What do you do when you're faced by a set of references and a set of assumptions that you just can't think a modern audience will adopt? Now, I'm sure you're familiar that if you go to Shakespeare, you often see a bad production of Shakespeare where every actor spends their time trying to explain what the difficult language means, trying to explain obscure Shakespearean puns with hand gestures or by jumping up and down in some form or another to emphasize the words. And it remains completely incomprehensible or absolutely alienating when they do that. And in the same way, lots of times with Shakespeare, they simply cut out the references that might be relevant to local politics or to particular times. But when you come to Greek tragedy, it's jolly hard because you can't really think about Greek tragedy, you might assume, without doing something about divinities, without the gods, without the sort of language of what we might call myth. How can you stage a play like the Oresteia, which is absolutely replete with choral songs about this myth and that myth, and which has gods on stage, for Christ's sake? Words I use advisedly. So what are we going to do? How do we deal with the fact that we're dealing with an audience that may know nothing? Well, let me tell you three stories to help us along in this discussion. The first is a deep old story. You may have seen in your time the film Troy, which starred Brad Pitt. Now, That is, I must admit, not a tragedy, except perhaps in terms of cultural value or something. But it's a perfectly acceptable film, very good, opened across the world on the same day. And for various reasons, I was asked to review it for the Evening Standard. Not something I'm hugely proud of, but hey, occasionally academics need a bit of extra cash. And I went along to the very first showing of Troy in London, along with the journalists from Times and Sunday Times or whatever. And we sat in a small art theatre to watch Troy. Before we went in, we had to sign a waiver in which we promised not to give away the plot. Well, it was a bit of a terrible shock to me to think, well, the fall of Troy has been in the public domain for quite a long time. And, the idea that you don't say Troy falls in this film, oh my God, was actually just made me laugh. Of course, when you went in there and saw the play and you saw that actually the film, they'd actually changed the plot in the most extraordinary manner so that Menelaus is actually killed, which destroys a whole lot of the Odyssey. You could see why they didn't want anybody to talk about it. But nonetheless, it struck me as fascinating that they didn't want plot spoilers in your review of any sort at all. Why not? Because it might produce assumptions, I suppose, might give away the excitement. I'm not altogether sure. That's my first story, and it's about popular culture and the attempt to control what an audience knows by controlling what reviews come. That's big business, and that's the big film business. Theatre is slightly less worrying, but we'll come to some stories about that in 1 minute. The second story comes from a completely different angle. I happen at the moment to be running a very large project called Humanity's Urban Future, which is about the future of human beings in cities and how cities are developing. And I was in Toronto for one of our group meetings, and we saw a film about Toronto called Brother, based on the book by David Chariandi called Brother. It's an excellent film. It's won many, many prizes, and it's an excellent book, which has won many prizes. And it's about an area of Toronto called Scarborough, which is a suburb, which is a small, quite rough black suburb, and it involves the story of the life of two brothers in that particular suburb, one of whom ends up being killed. And we watched this film, and it was very, very moving, and it's a very powerful film about city life. And at the end of the film, of course, we're 14 academics in a private cinema. We're going to have a discussion. And not for the first time in my life, I asked the first question, and I said, where's the city in this film? And I was turned on by the whole group. And they all said, that's exactly the wrong question to ask. You're treating this film as if it's Woody Allen. There are no skyscrapers. It's not that sort of a film. How could you have said that? Da, 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 da. And I was completely humiliated. But the reason I'd asked the question was because of a scene right in the middle of the film, or a third of the way through the film, which seemed to me to be absolutely central, seminal, indeed programmatic. And it turned out that nobody else in the cinema had even noticed the scene taking place. I ended up writing a piece about it for my group, and I finally admitted I was right. And the scene was this. The hero of the film, who's a young black guy, goes into a library for what is clearly the first time in his life. And he goes into the library for the first time, he's like 17 years old, because there's a rather beautiful girl in there he wants to meet. So it's a sort of it's one of those cute meet cutes of a cinema. And he goes in and he sees her working. She's actually very scholarly, and part of the plot of the film is she goes off to get a scholarship and comes back later, and it's a more complicated plot for that reason. But he comes up to her and he grabs a book off the shelf and sits opposite her reading it without looking at what he's taking off the shelf. And he's sitting there. He says, oh, do you like that? He said, oh, yes, it's one of my favorite books, he says, holding it up to camera. And it's Sophocles' Oedipus. Now, of course, I thought that's a bit of a hint to an audience to think Oedipus, right? Not too complicated. When you hold a book up to the camera and say, look at this book, that's a way of saying this is a plot for the film. And indeed, within 2 minutes, the girl has asked the boy, where's your father? And he says, I don't know where my father is. And his loss of his father and who he is part of the plot of the film. So there are a whole series of Oedipal questions. Now, as soon as you say Oedipus to me and you say Greek tragedy, one of the things you think about is the city versus the individual, the oikos and the polis, the family. And what I was fascinated by was the fact that there was no representation of the city in this version of the suburban black life. The city was always somewhere else, next to the city. And indeed, the book makes it quite clear that the absence of the city is part of their problem. They live in a sort of no man's land, which isn't real civic life. So that's what I thought I was talking about. But nobody, 13 professional academics of considerable brilliance, faced by a film in which somebody holds up a book to the camera that says, "This is Oedipus, it's my favorite book," right, doesn't get the point that that's telling you something about the plot of the film. That's completely different from my example of Troy, but it shows you how hard it is to guess what an audience is going to do, what an audience is going to know. And that leads me on to my most shocking example, which comes from last week. Well, within the last couple of weeks. I went to the opening night of Robert Icke's new production of Oedipus at the Wyndhams in London. And if you haven't got tickets yet, you should get them immediately. It's a really, really moving evening. It's absolutely fabulous. And I'm going to talk about it right at the end of this talk in more detail. Stars Mark Strong and Leslie Manville. It's extremely powerful and emotionally really wrenching by the end of it. And what surprised me was that at the moment at which Jocasta becomes aware that Oedipus, her extremely powerful husband, is in fact her son, at least 8 or 9 people in the audience went, "Oh," because they didn't know the plot. They didn't know about Oedipus. How could this possibly be? How could you have lived in the 21st century and not know Oedipus as a story? And I thought, well, maybe I've got that wrong. Or maybe it was so moving and so terrible. They were just expressing emotion. And I was at the after party of the opening night party, and I met one of the funders and a lawyer in his 60s, a journalist, a legal journalist. And we started talking, and it turned out that neither of them knew the plot of the Oedipus. And the lawyer who said, or journalist who said, "Look, I'm quite an educated child. I thought that was a pretty strong stuff. I mean, blimey. I mean, the plot of the Oedipus that he said to his mum was news to them. Now, how could this be? I thought, how could this be? And this really captures the problem of how do you make a play from antiquity for modernity? What sorts of levels of knowledge can you possibly expect an audience to have? Now, I learned about this as a problem most strikingly from the director of the current Oedipus, Robert Icke, who I think is something of a genius as a theatrical director. I love his work. Sometimes it drives me mad, but I always enjoy being driven mad by him. But in general, I think his work has been absolutely first rate. And I'm going to come back to 2 of his productions in a minute. But Robert, who I taught in Cambridge, and this is one of the great links of being in Cambridge and why Cambridge matters so much to me as a background to my theatrical experience. I taught him as an undergraduate. He then came back as a director to write the Oresteia, his version of the Oresteia in Kings, in discussion with me. And then again with the Oedipus, I consulted on the plot of the Oedipus. And consequently, I've written for the program. Right, so that's a confession. When I'm selling the Oedipus, I'm also selling the program. I don't get cuts from it, but hey, it's you can go and read that. But what Robert taught me is that you can never expect a modern British audience to know anything. So the first time he asked me to write for the program of the Oresteia. It's a huge hit in London, went to New York, huge hit in New York, won lots of prizes. And he said, when you write, I wrote, a piece in the sort of way you do for a program on the Oresteia. And he sent it back immediately. And he said, "Thanks, Simon. It's absolutely, I love the piece, but could you make sure that could you just rewrite it a bit and not mention anywhere that Orestes kills his mum?" And I said, "What?" He said, "Well, I don't want a plot spoiler." I said, "People are going to come and see the Oresteia." No, he says, "They won't know." And I was totally amazed by that because, I grew up in a world, I teach in a world where you say Orestes and everyone goes, "Oh, matricide." We know that. But people don't know that. And what was fascinating about that production of the Oresteia, I don't know if you saw it, but it had a framework as if Orestes was going through a psychoanalytic session of a sort with a figure who eventually became Athene in the Eumenides, is probing him to tell the story differently. And the story of the matricide is actually staged 3 times, as he can't face it. The first time, Electra is sort of basically there and kills him. The second time, kills her. The second time, he's not really dead. The third time, finally, you get the mother's breast displayed, and then he kills her. And it's absolutely heartbreaking as he finally comes face to face with the fact of what he's done, having had 2 scenes in which he's been screamingly denying his own involvement in the matricide. And I can see why Robert didn't want anybody who didn't know that Orestes was going to kill his mother not to know that, because it was incredibly shocking when it finally came. And the revelation of the breast, something I'm afraid to say I did insist that he put in the plot as it's a crucial physicality of the play, became a moment of intense passion on stage and intensely involving for the audience. The vast majority of whom, it turned out, did not know Orestes was going to kill his mother. It was a shock. And that is, for me, a way in which I think, in general, most directors have completely missed that point. That in order to make a play, you have to be clear to your audience. That is to say, you have to have a plot that actually works in modern theatre. So how do you do that? Well, it's extremely hard if you do a straight translation. It's extremely difficult. I think most plays that I've seen on the London stage fail because they don't face up to the question of clarity of narrative and the potential for true emotional power. Alienation through lack of knowledge, through elitist knowledge, if you like, through obscure knowledge, is actually a bar to emotional engagement. Let me give examples of where it might work. The most famous production, I think, where it worked brilliantly was the Deborah Warner production of Sophocles' Electra. Sophocles' Electra is perhaps the most brutal play of Greek tragedy. It's one of my favorites. It's absolutely staggering. It's a brilliant play because, for modern production, because it's so stirring, so difficult, so emotionally painful. Both Zoe Wanamaker and other actresses, I mean, Fiona Shaw, most famously, both of them had to take to their bed after performing that for a series, and had to go to bed for a week or 2 because it was so incredibly disturbing to play. And with the Deborah Warner, Fiona Shaw production, which I talked to Deborah and to Fiona at great length about what was going on, it was fascinating to see how they grew into making the play available. They used one of the oldest translations by Watling, which is not a very good translation. And they took out some references to gods, but there aren't very many references. They didn't need to take out very many. What they did do, and this will form the second part of my discussion later on, is remove most of the chorus down to a couple of people. But when Fiona started in rehearsal, she started cigarettes with objects on stage, trying to work through how do you appear on stage when you're going to be on stage almost the whole play, almost naked, bitterly oppressed, violently emotional. She wanted things to do, and she worked with cigarettes, or she splashed in water, or gradually, as she got into the heart of the play, everything disappeared. And why that play worked so well was the extraordinary emotional rawness of a small theatre in which it was physically painful for the audience to sit with her, as she was so overwhelmingly emotional in what she did, which was, of course, the right way to play the extremely violent and disturbed Electra. And the lack of reference to the gods that Sophocles allows became an absolute strength in that play, as it did when Zoe Wanamaker did it. And that was a careful selection of play, a careful selection of text, and the removal of both all the externalities of staging, so that you're on a bare set pretty well, in bare rags pretty well, and only the crucial moments of references to Apollo's oracle were there. And they were comprehensible and clear. And the sheer power of the emotion overwhelmed the audience again and again. It was a staggering performance. When they went to Northern Ireland to play it in Derry a week after a particular set of problems there in the so-called Troubles, each night the audience refused to leave the theatre because what it had said about violence and revenge and the psychology of revenge spoke so painfully to the audience that they wouldn't go without a discussion. And each night the actors had to come on stage and talk about it. That's how ancient theatre can talk to modernity and should talk to modernity. It should disturb, it should upset, it should engage, it should be powerful. And you can't do that if you alienate people through obscure and difficult knowledge. So that's the first version. And that was something that stuck very close to Oedipus. It stuck very close to the script and to the script that Sophocles wrote and what being translated. The Electra has had a long history, Sophocles' Electra, of being a play about modernity. Strauss's opera Electra in 1910 got more column inches in the newspaper than the death of the king that year. It was so provocative and so difficult for people to understand. And that's because he removes all references to gods pretty well, all references to choruses pretty well. Even in an opera, there's barely a chorus in the first 5 minutes. And it focuses on Electra and her mother and their relationship. Indeed, I took a whole year of Newman classicists to see it one year with Helen Morales on a special fund. And they absolutely loved it, even people who'd never been to opera, even people who'd never been to London before, because watching an hour and a half of a girl screaming at her mother seemed to make perfect sense. Again, emotionally overwhelming. But what Robert Icke does that I find absolutely fascinating, and it's something that we can discuss, is that he completely rewrites the plays. And it's an extremely bold, extremely difficult gesture. He keeps the names of the characters. There's Oedipus and Jocasta and the others. Antigone pops up in this one. But he goes for what he thinks the heart of the play is. And he takes the plotting rather than the plot of Sophocles, and he puts it together, and he constructs a new play. It's his play. It's really Icke's Oedipus, not Sophocles' Oedipus. But what it does by going to the heart is absolutely getting at your heart. When it works, I think it's staggering. What scenes? I won't give away the Oedipus because you may not have seen it yet. But if you saw the Oresteia, you'll probably remember the extraordinary scene, which comes from the Iphigenia at Aulis rather than the Oresteia, which is a sort of the first play of his trilogy, when Agamemnon is involved in the death of his daughter, Iphigenia, whom he has to sacrifice so the fleet can go. And in this play, the Icke play, when he is persuaded that his daughter must die, and he understands the argument, and the persuasion is incredibly convincing. But the death of Iphigenia is not done as a sacrifice in the way that we might understand it from ancient texts. But the young girl sat on his knee, and as he talked to her, he gave her an injection. And it was one of the, I'm going to cry and even think about it, it was one of the most unpleasant scenes I've ever seen on the stage. And every night people walked out. Icke was delighted. So that's what I want, a real reaction. It was incredibly powerful. Now, it's not a scene that Euripides wrote or Sophocles wrote. The death of Iphigenia is there. How she dies, well, of course, as Agamemnon said, I don't know, we couldn't look. And he picks on that, I don't know, we couldn't look. And he turns it into a scene from which everybody wanted to turn their eyes. It was a moment of theatrical genius, I thought. So, my first point about how do you stage theatre has to be, what do you assume an audience knows? How do you create out of these ancient texts something that speaks to modernity? Sometimes, rarely, you can do it simply by the brilliance of having someone like Fiona Shaw speak in an Irish accent in Ireland. That's enough to make the connection, she is Irish after all, to the Troubles and the violence of the psychology of revenge. Other times you might want to rewrite. And I don't encourage everybody to rewrite plays, because generally playwrights are better than their modern interpreters. But in the case of Ike, what I think he does is really, really smart. But let me turn to my second topic, which is what do you do with the chorus? Now, there's always a problem for any version of modern tragedy, that you've suddenly got 12 or 14 people on stage the whole time breaking into song. And unless you are very, very committed to an idea of musicals, you're going to have a real problem making that tragic. And many people simply cut out choruses. And I think that's a real problem. If I had one argument with Rob Ike about his Oresteia, which I never resolved, by which I mean I never won, was the question of the collectivity of the chorus, which is particularly important in the Oresteia. I don't think it matters so much in the earlier plays as it does at the end. The end of the Oresteia is fundamentally an assertion of a collectivity of the polis. It involves a procession of the chorus of women with the Furies to the center of the city to make a sacrifice to celebrate the unity of the city. We can imagine it as ironic, we can imagine it as flawed, as full of ambivalence, and that's what Rob Ike picked up. He saw the ambivalence of the ending of the Oresteia and ended up with a scene that was exacerbated that ambivalence. But what he lost was the sense of political collectivity. And I thought that was the biggest flaw of his play. And it's very, very common in modern productions. But what we see again and again is a desire to express an emotional intensity that loses tragedy's political intensity. And the political intensity of tragic drama comes through the collectivity of the chorus and its relationship to the individual, one of those essential dynamics of democracy. Let me give you two examples, first of all, of where I think it's really worked or not worked, where people have tried for a chorus. My favorite is always, I'm going to give you three examples. My favorite was always the Oedipus, the Gospel at Colonus, which was a wonderful black gospel version of Oedipus, where Oedipus was played by three different singers. They were on pianos, the three blind boys of Alabama were there, and the chorus was a big gospel choir. And it worked because it sat there, it represented the collective, it represented collective wisdom, it sang beautifully and without any hint of, naive Hollywood musicality. And it contributed to the play in a way a chorus does, in the way that a chorus sometimes say, thank you very much for that bowl of cherries. I would like somebody else to say something now in between scenes. Well, the gospel chorus could go, yes, tell it like it is, God, tell it to God, and other sorts of shouts. And it made a perfect framework for the play. And that was because in the gospel version, there was a chorus that was tied to a social purpose. The chorus made sense. It had a life of its own. So in Oedipus, you could do it, I suppose, with the cabinet, as it were, because Oedipus in our play is surrounded, of course, in Sophocles' play, by the elders of the city. So you could imagine a political cabinet or equivalent next to the king, and that would make sense. But for many plays, it's extremely difficult to explain in modern terms why there is a group of people constantly on stage, and many directors just flee from the problem. One director who doesn't flee from the problem is Annie Castledine. And Annie Castledine directed at the RSC, and she directed at the National Theatre. And we had the benefit of her directing twice for the Cambridge Greek play. As part of our professionalization, was taking very, very serious professional directors to come to do the Greek play. And when I was the producer of the play, as I was then, thankfully I've now been kicked upstairs to chair the committee, Annie used to phone me regularly in the morning at 6:30, which in my household was slightly too early for a call. And the phone would ring, and I'd pick up the phone, and she'd always say in her deep, incredibly theatrical voice, darling, do you know who this is? Yes, Annie, I do. And she would say, we need another chair for that. Okay, Annie, I'll do it later. Anyway, but she was also produced, one of the reasons why we took her is she produced a very interesting production of the Trojan Women at the National Theatre, which some of them may have seen. And it was extremely interesting because the Trojan Women of all plays, Euripides' Trojan Women, really depends on its chorus. The chorus of raped and brutalized prisoners of war provide really the through thread of the drama and their responses to the scenes on stage. And it's almost impossible to do without a choral presence. And there's a real reason for the choral presence to be there, because it's set in a prisoner of war camp, and prisoners of war are in some sense a collective. And Annie's production was pretty successful, it must be said. It's national theatre. But I had a real problem with it for this reason. One thing that I argued with her about it a lot. Her chorus was basically a group of brutalized women, but they were depicted as brutalized women who were the victims of a group of American imperial soldiers, as it were. So they were produced as if they were from Afghanistan or similar countries in the Middle East, and they were dressed as such. And the Greeks were dressed as Americans. I thought, on the one hand, of course, this produced a particular political version of the play, and it did so with a certain degree of acerbity, and it did so because it matched Annie's political views. Right? Good, solid Guardian reader, our Annie. But for me, it let the audience off the hook. The whole point of the Trojan Women, for me, is not that it's about somebody else's imperialism, but it's about ours. It's about Greek imperialism, Greek violence. The Trojans speak Greek. They are close to, related to the Greeks. And the people who are brutalizing them are people like us. And if you know, when it was produced around the time of the destruction of Milos and the violence that Athens was committing in the world, you can see why letting them off was not a good move by Annie. That's a place where she managed to get some politics in, but the politics wasn't sharp enough. An alternative version might be Minushkin's famous Oresteia, most wonderful production from Paris that came to England and produced only in a warehouse in Leeds, but certainly when I was there, pretty well every famous actor in the world was in the audience. It was quite extraordinary going to the bar. It was like sort of walking into a picture of Vogue's Hollywood. It was really quite exciting because it was such an interesting performance, and very, very famous with her Théâtre du Soleil. What she did, of course, is to produce a production which had no claim on reality. That's to say, it produced a chorus, fabulous dancing, fabulous music from a huge band, but the chorus were dressed in some strange oriental costume, mainly as if it were from Japanese no theatre, but with Chinese grotesquerie added in. And they danced fantastically around the stage as if they were flying at various points. But there was no suggestion whatsoever that this had a political connection to any collectivity that we might recognize in England or in France. It was deliberately set somewhere else. The story was unfurled in a very particular way. And what was interesting was, to me, is that one of the translators of this was Hélène Cixous, a famous French feminist. And what the production concentrated on was on certain sorts of gender politics that was going on in that play. And it was brilliantly done, very, very effective. But it chose its politics, and from its politics came its chorus. It was integral, it worked, but it lacked a certain version of the grand political scheme that Aeschylus would ask you to think about the state as a whole. But it was a fantastically successful production. And where I want to finish, I think today, will be with Robert Icke's Oedipus, to talk you through a little bit of that. Because once again, what he did, which I found quite extraordinary, was, and admissible, allowable, even though I'm a classicist who's meant to be a gatekeeper, as it were, is he cut the chorus altogether. There was no suggestion of chorus whatsoever. That's to say, there was no one on stage who played the role of chorus. We had an assistant to Jocasta, who, Indian, looked like Queen Victoria's assistant. We had the brothers Polynices and Eteocles and Antigone were on stage. We had Merope, who was Oedipus's, as it were, foster mother in Corinth. But There was no chorus. All there was a video screen in one corner, which was not very distracting, that played a constant newsreel of Oedipus's electoral possibility. It was set in times of the election of Oedipus to the kingship and to the realship. And the result of that was fascinating, because what it did, typically, it seems to me, is to turn the play into a particular drama of psychological anguish about knowing who you are, knowing where you are. And of course, that's true for Sophocles. Sophocles thinks of it as a psychologically crippling drama about knowing and not knowing. The name Oedipus is often etymologized as swollen foot, but in the play, as well as that etymology, we have a second series of etymologies all around the name Oedipus. I know where I am, Oedipus, or I know, I think, Oedipus, which is also good Greek. So do you know where you are is a crucial part of Oedipus's drama. But one of the things that makes Sophocles' play particularly profound is that he can set that intensely personal drama within a framework of the whole city, of the city being sick. And while that starts off in Oedipus's case, in Robert Icke's place, we get a sense of that. It completely disappears by the end, which might be okay. It justified, I mean, it's certainly justified by the emotional effect of the play. But what I find fascinating to think about for us, as we think about the modern theatre and ancient tragedy, is our general resistance as an audience, as playwrights, as production teams, as audience and actors, to deal with what a collectivity might mean, what a group might look like, and how tragedy is different if you think of it as a relationship between groups and individuals. Oedipus is certainly partly about belonging, about where you fit in some ways. But without the place into which you're meant to fit, you've changed the nature of the drama. And so one of the things I'm always looking for when I see what a play is doing is to see, can it actually put together the brilliance of tragedy's attack on the security of identity, its attack on personal feeling, its attack on sense that you know where you are, all that personal thrust that makes tragedy so wrenching, together with tragedy's political framework, which is what the city provides in Athens as a literal framework, as a structure in which tragedy takes place, and which is a constant presence in the play. Even perhaps Sophocles' Electra, a play in which the city barely appears in any form at all, we always know that somewhere lurking is a bigger story, and that's what the chorus brings to bear into the story when they appear. And so, while I see the attraction of making these stories solely about personal drama, for me, you need to have the politics of the collectivity on stage too, or you might be missing a bit of a trick. That said, over the years, I've seen some absolutely fantastic productions. Rob Icke's Oedipus is right up there with the best. And I've seen some terrible ones, some mistakes, some awful disasters of not understanding the plays deeply enough. And I think what is most remarkable is that of all ancient genres, of all ancient writing, the one form that at the moment is getting constant attention in modernity across the world is Greek tragedy. It still speaks profoundly to people in America, in Europe, and even in Africa and in Asia, especially in Africa, where it's formed the basis of some of the greatest of modern works of African theatre. So one thing when people tell us that we should be anxious about the future of classics, one place where I think it's safe is in theatre. provided we keep working to make modernity part of ancient theatre. Thank you. Stop.